everyone, this is Veronica with Sew It Seams, and welcome back. Today I'm going to do a short tutorial on paper piecing using the folded method. When paper piecing by hand, it's difficult to sew through the paper like you would do with a sewing machine, so being able to fold it makes it a lot easier. We're going to paper piece on this triangle section, and when we look at this, we have to find a way that we can break it apart into sections so that it's easier to sew together. I can't start paper piecing here in the corner and then work out and then into each row all at once. It would become too awkward and it just wouldn't work. So I've already cut this pattern into 3 rows, and you can see we have 3 strips. So we'll work on each strip individually and then sew them all together. Here are a few tools that I use when I paper piece my blocks. I use an Elmer's glue stick for adhering that very first piece of fabric. When working with these very small blocks, pins will get in the way, so having a glue stick makes it much easier for that very first piece to hold it in place. I also use pins. This is to hold all the other pieces in place while I'm sewing. The most valuable tool that I have is this add a quarter ruler. You can do paper piecing without this ruler, but it is a little more difficult. This ruler is 12 inches. They do come also in 6 inches, and it's called an add a quarter ruler. But they call that because there is this 1/4 of an inch that is grooved on there so that you can do your paper piecing. You can kind of see that here. This really helps when you're folding and trimming your pieces. Along with my add a quarter ruler, I have a straight edge, and this one is just a laminated bookmark that is nice and sturdy so that I can fold my paper and fabric as I need to when I'm creating my different parts of the block. When you're paper piecing, one thing to keep in mind is that you are doing everything in reverse. So I can have this pattern here, and if this is the way I want my pattern to look, it actually will not. When it is finished sewing, it will be reversed, and my fabric will be, when you look at this one, my colored fabric is on this end, but since it will be reversed when I'm done sewing, it will be in this direction. My colored fabric will be on this end. So it's very important to keep in mind that when you're paper piecing, everything needs to be reversed so that you can have it in the direction you want. If it's a symmetrical pattern, then it won't matter. But for this one, it is not symmetrical. It does have a definite pattern and leaning. So I've already gone through, and I know that I'm going to have a colored piece that it will actually need to be on this side when it's finished, and then it'll be colored, plain, colored, plain, colored, plain. So let's begin. I'm going to start sewing from this end down. So first I need a piece of fabric that's going to fit this triangle. One thing with paper piecing is that there can tend to be some waste of fabric. It just is part of the nature of the beast, but it does create some very nice results. For this first piece, I line up my fabric. Now I have my right side is going to be away from the back of the paper, so it's wrong sides together. This is my pattern piece. This is what I'm looking at. This is going to be considered the wrong side of the paper, and this is the wrong side of my fabric. I am making sure I have enough here so that I have enough of a seam allowance. So I kind of line this up here, and I see that basically I just need to cut this piece of fabric here. So I'm going to just cut this little piece right off the end. Now, using my glue stick, I will put a bit of glue on the back of the paper, and then I have my fabric lined up just right in the middle there. So here's the right side of my fabric, and this is kind of where you'll see, the pattern emerging. I have plenty of fabric around these two sides for my 1/4 inch when I'm going to be trimming them up and sewing them to other pieces. But I don't need to worry about this. I'm just going to leave this as is. What I'm focused on now is this seam here. This is going to be my sewing seam. But I need to trim it to make sure it's to size. This is where my straight edge comes in. I bring it right up to that line. I'm going to fold my paper over. Now I have this part here to trim a 1/4 inch. Put my add 1/4 ruler here, and that groove butts right up there. And now I can trim that 1/4 inch. I'll remove that. Now I have a nice 1/4 inch here to be able to sew. Now I need a piece of my muslin because my next piece is going to be muslin. But let me show the back. So here we have that nice straight smooth edge. I have a piece of muslin here. It's a scrap piece that I'm going to see if it will fit here. This is where it can be a little tricky to find out if your fabric will actually have enough space. You can't just line it up here because we need to have it right sides together. So I'm going to place it right sides together, but since this is at an angle, it can be hard to see whether you have enough fabric or not. I'm going to fold my pattern over. Now, I can see right here, this is the next stitching line, which means I need to have enough of my muslin fabric here to cover to the next pattern. And when I look at this, I can fold up that, and it looks like it's going to be cutting it a little close with this muslin here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my muslin down just a little bit. So when I bring my fabric up, I see I have enough that's going to clear for that seam allowance. That to me actually looks, it just right here, I'm looking at my pattern, comes right to that edge, and I may not have enough of that muslin. So I'm actually going to turn this. We're going to turn it this way. Oh, this will be much better. Okay, I'm adjusting it down. Okay. Now, when I bring this back, okay, I have my muslin lined up, and my muslin pattern goes down here and here. So when I'm looking at the muslin here, I have enough of a clearance. I will show you. See, there's quite a bit there. Okay. Now when you're sewing paper piecing by machine, you would open this up and you'd sew right through that paper. But I don't want to sew through paper when I'm doing hand piecing. It will never stay, and it will be very difficult to sew through. So I keep my pattern folded, and I'm going to pin. Now I will pin through the paper to keep it stationary. Whoops. All right, I have my first seam pinned and ready to sew. With stitching for paper piecing, you will stitch in the same way that you do for all the other hand piecing. Just make sure that you have a nice solid anchor stitch at the beginning and at the end, because that will be where you have different parts that are going to be coming together. And if you're not sure how to do some hand piecing, I do have another video. Just look for the hand piecing video and I will try to link that. The first seam is now sewn. So I'm going to open up the paper pattern and also fold back my muslin. And you can see that it all lines up very nicely. I've got plenty. The muslin comes all the way to the end here, and there's plenty of room for that whole stitch. So now let's press this flat. And now I'm ready to work on the next piece. So I have one piece here and one here. Now we'll go to the next one. First we'll need to trim just like we did with the very first piece. So I place this up to the next seam that I need to sew. I fold this over, put my add a quarter ruler and trim. Now I'm ready for the next fabric. The next fabric is going to be orange. So once again, I have to kind of eyeball what I'm going to need. And let's see, here is my triangle. And I cut it pretty generously. And this is where the complaints come from, all the waste. But it's a particular method, and paper piecing results in a particular look. Now with some pieces you could, like for this one, I could just cut out a bunch of templates. But paper piecing will give you a lot of precision that you may not be able to get with other types of piecing. All right, now we're going to once again have right sides together. So I will place this right sides together here, and my pattern I'm going to look at, here is the triangle. So here's the point. I need to come down, and I look to make sure that I'm lining up enough to give me enough pattern or enough space. Looking, here is the end of my triangle. Looks like I need to shift this down just a little. There we go. Now I've got enough of a seam allowance there, and I'm looking, and I've got plenty to come all the way around. So once again, I'm going to pin these, and then I'm ready to stitch this seam. When you're doing paper piecing, you do want to make sure that you are anchoring, especially right at this corner, right where the patterns meet. Now, as you get to the end here, I am now coming across my previous seam from the last two pieces. A nice good anchor, and then extend the stitch out just a couple of stitches. This will give you a little bit more stability, especially on some pieces that are pretty tiny. This will allow you to have it be a little bit more stable and straight. Okay, so now we've got that sewn on. I'm going to open up that pattern. I'm opening up this, and you can see from the back side here, this is where my orange piece should be, and you can see my seam extends out here. I have plenty extended out here and beyond here for that seam allowance. So let's give this a good press. And now we have 3 pieces sewn onto our strip. I'm going to continue in this method to get this whole row. As you continue to stitch your pieces, remember the only thing that is anchoring your entire thing is this bit of glue that you had on this very first piece. I find that it's after I've manipulate things a while that the glue will start to release. When we're sewing paper piecing by machine, we're coming right through the paper, and so it's being anchored in that way. Once I get far enough away where the iron doesn't get in the way or the add a quarter ruler, I will pin right down here just to anchor my piece so it doesn't keep shifting or come apart. And this will help to keep this all together. If I have a longer piece, I would then pin more as I go. But right now, just one pin in here will help to anchor that so I don't get shifting, and then it kind of ruins my whole process. So I'm going to continue to do this paper piecing along this strip. This first row is complete, and you can see the pattern design coming across here. I have it pinned on both ends to keep it from shifting. And with this pattern, it can be lifted off and reused. And since these are all exactly the same, all 3 of these pieces, I could do that. And that's something, since this is not sewn onto the paper, that it can be reused. The important thing to keep in mind, though, is that you would need to know where your seam line is. So before I even take anything off, I would draw my seam allowance all the way around this pattern. And actually, I like to do that anyway on some of these, just in case my pattern does come off. And now I can actually remove my pins if I wanted to, and remove that pattern, and I've got it traced all the way around. Since I will be lining up rows together, what I'm going to trim are the sides, but I'm not going to worry about the ends right now. So I have my 1/4 inch right in there. Now I trimmed 1/4 inch, and you can see that my piece did not quite come all the way to 1/4 inch. I'm not concerned about that because I know that I will be stitching by hand here and it will be caught in, so there won't be a problem. But that is something to be aware of, that you really do need to make sure you have enough fabric there. Let's trim this other side. Leaving that 1/4 inch extra. And then when I turn this over, you can see that pattern of the triangles, which in the block when it's finished will be in this way. So now I'm going to do exactly the same thing 2 more times. I am now finished sewing all 3 of the rows of the paper piecing, and you can see we've got some cute little triangles. On the back of each piece I have my seam allowance drawn. So before I removed the paper template that was on the back, I drew my seam allowance so I'll know where my stitching lines are. Now it's time to match these up together. I'm going to start with these 2. And with this, we are working at an angle. So our point here is going to need to match up with our point here. So let's get our pins. And I'm going to start with my pin coming right through that point. I've got my line here. Right here is where that triangle meets up. So you see my pin came right through there. And then I'm going to have my triangle point here is where my pin is going to go through. And I check on the back, and I'm coming right through that seam line. Okay, so those are matched up perfectly. Here's my next one. I'm going to get my pin right through the point of this triangle where my seam is. And once again, you can see it's coming right through that point of that triangle. And then my needle's going to go through the point of that triangle. And when I look on the back, it comes right through. Now normally I would not put so many pins, but this is going to be getting pretty bulky. I've got a triangle point here, which means I have 1, 2, 3 pieces of fabric all seaming here, and then also 3 pieces of fabric seaming here. So I have 6 pieces of fabric all converging into this one point here. Same as over here. So the more pins I have, the less it's going to shift and the more exact my stitching line is going to be. Now we're on the end here. I'm going to put my pin right in this corner where my seam allowance is. And it's going to be along this line, but on my seam allowance, I'm not sure where that line was drawn. So there it is, right there. And I've got to make sure that I'm still right at the edge. There we go. Okay. So I've got my line there, lined up, and I'm just going to pin it down. Then I'm going to come over here, and right here my seam allowance comes right up, or my stitching line comes right up here where the pieces of fabric meet. And now I'm going to flip it over and go right through that quarter. And I'm at that point, so now I will have my pin at an angle. So I have the points where my pins are going through are right on the stitching line, and when I flip it over, where the pin is coming through is also right on the stitching line. This is just another anchor, but right here and there. So now I'm going to just do my hand stitching all the way across. To keep this from kind of pulling apart, I'm going to anchor my stitch a little bit beyond either side of this stitching line. The center of the paper pieced pattern is now completely done, and I can trim this piece up. as I've been doing each paper piece section, I traced the outline. So this is where the stitching line is. So I will trim that 1/4 of an inch all the way around. Here is my finished section that I was doing paper piecing. You can see it just has really nice triangles here that meet up pretty closely. And here is the back, just with all the seams there. This method can be used for any different sections of these Dear Jane blocks that you want to do paper piecing. It's just a matter of making sure that you look at each section and how it can easily be translated into doing some paper piecing. I hope showing you this method of how I do folded paper piecing is helpful for you in creating some of your own blocks. If you have any questions, you can comment below or send me an email at sewitseamscreations@outlook.com. This is Veronica Johnson with Sew It Seams, and remember, keep stitching.